Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining this special screening of African Apocalypse. I hope you're excited about seeing the film as I am. I've just finished watching it. It was a really brilliant, creative, dynamic, and provocative insight into not only the histories of colonialism in Niger and other parts of the African continent, but also a reflection on how these legacies have echoes in our contemporary moment, shaping global politics, racism, and neocolonialism. This evening, we're fortunate enough to be joined by Dr. Ami Baini, historian and political scientist who's done a great deal of work and activism relating to the African continent. We're joined by the director of the film, Rob Lemkin, as well as the presenter, Femi Nylander. So maybe, Femi, we can start with as the presenter and one of the people who helped to put the film together. Can you talk to us a little bit about what brought you to this particular story and why you thought it was something you wanted to make into a film?
So what brought me to this particular story actually was Rob, in a way, because I was already looking into colonial history and looking quite deeply into the UK's colonial history. I had done some stuff on France Afrique, and I was actually in a pub in Oxford, an open mic night, doing a performance of a song called France Afrique, which is about the French exploitation of various African nations, and another song about the Congo. And Rob's partner was there, and she was like, "Oh, my partner has been thinking about making a film on colonialism, but he's looking for someone kind of relevant to do it with." And that's actually how we ended up meeting in a kind of cafe in Oxford and talking for hours about France Afrique, about Gabon, about Niger, about the rest, and eventually about Voulet. And from there came the plotting to go off to Niger and to really tell this particular story of this particular officer, Voulet, who obviously represents a much wider system of colonial destruction, not just by France, but by the UK, by Portugal, by Germany, by Belgium, famously in the Congo, and really the European kind of division of the African continent in the Berlin Conference and beyond.
Great. And Rob, what was it that brought you to this particular story? Why was this something that for you this arose as something that needed to be made into a motion picture, something that needed to be a story that needs to be told?
Well, I'd worked on a few films when I was a producer at the BBC about colonialism in Southeast Asia, in Malaya, or Malaysia as it is now, and Burma. And those were films that were done as historical films. But I did really feel that that was back in the 90s. What I did really feel was that colonialism was something that was just not acknowledged as the undergirding reality of the life and the economy and the social life of the Western world, really, or maybe of the whole world, but certainly of the Western world, of how we live here in Europe and America. And it just wasn't acknowledged. So I was really keen to try and find a way of making a film that would be somehow kind of universal about imperialism, as opposed to the ones that I'd done before, which had been very much targeted on investigations into British colonial rule and stuff and all that kind of thing. So I was, so it was, in fact, it was before I met Femi that I first went to Niger to sort of map out the sort of what became this film. So I started working on it for the BFI probably a couple of years before I met Femi. And I think the reason I was going there was, but I suppose I felt that Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, although it's a very controversial text, it was part of my thinking about how could you make a film that was universal. And then when I read in a book that actually about this man Voulet, this French officer Voulet, that he, at the same time that Conrad was writing Heart of Darkness, actually this guy was kind of almost living the story of Heart of Darkness. I mean, not totally literally, but pretty close in many aspects, obviously, as we go into in this film. I felt, wow, this was a real chance to sort of to tell a story that was maybe unknown, maybe has a kind of dramatic interest. And you know, obviously I'd been originally interested in more in British imperialism, but I think, you know, all Europe went into the making of Kurtz, as Joseph Conrad says. So I think it was kind of helping to go universal. And then, having been to Niger and sort of planned what you could do there and what you could see, and I suppose really discovering what you see in this film, that actually this history is still very present there, I was looking to see how I could collaborate and find a way of actually telling the story, because I didn't really want to do it as a documentary from my own point of view. I wanted to do it as some kind of collaboration. So I had been sort of looking around for people to meet, and as Femi says, my partner was down at the James Street Tavern at the end of my road, and Femi was on an open mic night singing a song for Congo, and then we met a few days later, and there was a kind of a big overlap of interest and energy, and I thought, well, that's good. We can really kind of, now maybe we can really actually think about making this film.
So obviously the film kind of begins with this story, of a kind of very specific story around the colonization or the kind of imperial incursion by the French into Niger. But of course, it's part of a wider story of European colonization of the African continent. Amber, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the effects that this, I guess, the carving up of Africa had on particularly this part of West Africa. I know West Africa is where a lot of your research and writing has focused, and the effect that it had more generally on the life, on the economy, and the general well-being of the people that were affected by this this incursion at the end of the 19th century.
I think before I address your question, I'd like to commend the film for a number of reasons before I answer that very huge question. I commend the film for the fact that it took a bottom-up approach to history as opposed to a top-down approach to history. We get to see in the film the oral voices, the villagers, the ordinary people of Niger talk about their history. And I think Femi actually is told by one villager that nobody ever comes to ask us about our history. So for me, that was very important. And we hear that the ordinary people very clearly, very eloquently, and poignantly talk about their experiences under colonialism. And I also commend both Femi and Rob for the parallel juxtaposition of the Heart of Darkness, excerpts of that being read alongside, showing how that was lived through Captain Voulet, the pillage, plunder and massacre. And we see the human consequences of that pillage and plunder on the people of Niger as he seeks to fulfill his personal ambitions. And then I'd like to commend the partisanship of Femi in particular, because that's admirable, particularly when bourgeois history is often presented and people are told that history should be objective or engage with objectivity and impartiality and neutrality. And we see that Femi, as a result of his guides questioning him as to his seeming lack of emotion, and he has to reveal that you know, he does feel and he is impacted upon by what he hears. So I think the film again shows that, you know, sometimes in history, we cannot stand on the sidelines. We have to take sides, and not to do so is to engage in denialism and to actually become immoral in not taking sides and not condemning the atrocities that we see. And I think a last importance of the film that I see is that it shows, and very brilliantly, that history is never past. I think, as the great William Faulkner once said, you know, the past is never dead. The past is never past. It continues to live in and remanifest and reconfigure itself particularly in the context of Africa, in new forms of coloniality, new forms of exploitation, new forms of dependence that we see. And we see in the film that the colonial partition or empire or colonialism was really violence that was inflicted on the minds, the bodies, and the land of African people. And one of the ways that came out again very poignantly, magnificently, was the fact that we learn that the people of Niger were made to exploit uranium, and that story is told again very beautifully and very touchingly, harrowingly, through the two men that Femi interviews with, and one loses a kidney through uranium. But we also learned that that exploitation, economic exploitation, allowed the French to exploit uranium up until 2014 tax-free. And to me, that is a very poignant, very clear example of the many ways in which the people of Niger, the people of Africa, through colonialism, were exploited for the economic resources and riches of their continent. Politically, one of the impacts or ramifications of colonialism was the carving up of Africa with these artificial borders that remain to this day. And that took place in the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, in which 14 European nations, chairperson or the chair of that conference was Chancellor Bismarck of Germany, and the 14 nations carved up the continent of Africa without one African voice or person being present. And those colonial borders remain to this day. And again, that's reflected in the film when a young girl says that, you know, these borders, this road that was built from Niger to Nigeria need not have been built, because we had ways of communicating and transporting ourselves, you know, long before the colonialists came. But these borders, these real life borders, continue to this day on the African continent, and continue to divide the African continent, continue to disunite African people. So those are some of the political and economic ways in which the scramble for Africa, as it was called, have left its legacy upon African people to this day.
I think really raises some really interesting points there. I want to pick up on one of them for you, Femi, which is about, I guess, the kind of the personal journey that you went on, as well as the kind of historical, political, and social journey. And I think one of them, which I think kind of arises at the start of the film, but I think it's picked up a number of points, is this kind of insider-outsider relationship that you have with this part of the African continent, where you're in a world in which you're surrounded by Black people, people who look like you, but at the same time, you're an outsider. I think there are a couple of moments, one in which I think you're entering a village and someone is sent to give a message, I think, to a person in a position of power in the village, tell them you've arrived, and they said, Femi's arrived, he's Nigerian and English, but tell them he's English. And I think there's another moment where I think you're getting into a securitized van or vehicle, and you say, and they say that, you know, you're English, but you're Black, but you're English, so you might as well be white. Could you talk a little bit about how you navigated the way in which, I guess, you were racialized changed as you moved from the center of empire to one of its peripheries?
So I remember very well both of those moments. So the village was town really, Birnin Konni, and we were there arriving, and it was he's Nigerian, because obviously Birnin Konni itself lies right at the border between Nigeria and Niger. It's kind of Hausa land, but it's very, very, very close to the border of Nigeria. And so to say that someone is Nigerian in that context means this person really is kind of from just down the road, rather than if you were to go somewhere like Agadez, where it's Tuareg people and there isn't that cultural kind of that shared culture. So we're at the heart of Hausa land. So to say this person's Nigerian, at one of the hotels in Birnin Konni, I remember one of the boys who was working at the hotel, he was like, oh no, I don't speak French, I speak English because I'm from Nigeria. I bus in to work at this hotel, right? It was that close. So again with the soldiers, I remember that particular interaction as well. It was actually the general of the soldiers who I spoke with quite a lot, and we would discuss things, and we would kind of. I was learning a bit of Hausa, so I'd try and use the language, and I was trying to, and he was like, "Femi, cool, you're here," but at the same time, "Kai farine," which means that you're white one, really. You come from Europe and you have that mentality, especially when we got to talking about things like the relationship between Islam and the continent and the rest. It was very interesting, and I guess it was in a way very true, especially as I'm a black person from the UK who has passed through very white institutions. My primary school, there wasn't that many black kids. Oxford obviously has had reams of publications noted in recent years about how its access problems are there and how unrepresentative it is of Afro-Caribbean communities. And so the fact that I was not only black and from England, but had spent years in these white institutions, meant that I was going there, and there really was an element of this kind of switch. And obviously some of that would have been picked up on. I don't think that the Sultan of Birnin Konni or the soldiers picked up on the fact that I don't have a Peckham accent, right? But I do think that they picked, so that I don't think they picked up on the subtleties within the UK context, but they definitely picked up on the fact that I looked like them, even though some people in the crew, even though Rob, who was there with us, didn't look like them. But in some way, I was still the one being protected by the soldiers, right? I was still the one in this kind of to bring the Marlowe of the story, if you were going to continue with the parable of the Heart of Darkness, right? And so that was a really interesting kind of middle ground to play on. And I think one thing that happened through the film is you see a slight shift from the outsider to the insider in a way. The first time I sit down with the villagers, I'm there, I'm talking to them English, I'm quite uncomfortable. Near the end, I have the Tuareg turban on. I'm speaking to the people about the club's death in the native tongue, and it's a bit more involved. And by the end, you've got Hassan saying, "Get up, we're not here to respect the dead," and you can see that I'm kind of a bit more plugged in, and that's definitely something I felt happening in real time. And I remember both of those interactions, and both of them were similar in terms of a bit of a kick back to reality to the scene that Amma mentioned with Amina and Hassan, where I was told that I needed to show more feeling.
Something else that Emma, I think, picked up on, which I'd like to elaborate a little more on, is about the effects of colonialism, is also the fact that colonialism wasn't simply a military project and an economic project and a social project. It was also considered by many of the European powers to be a moral project, the spreading of civilization and other such illusions. And I think that you mentioned Klob and Klob's death, and I don't want to ruin too much of the film for those who haven't seen it. But I think what is really interesting and worth maybe discussing a little bit more is how the violence that took place in colonized Niger was seen as potentially an embarrassment for the empire. It wasn't the fact that there were some human rights abuses, or this was seen as, something that can't happen for moral reasons, but it was more the fact that I guess that could potentially damage the prestige of France and its imperial ambitions. I was wondering if Amma and Rob, you could talk a little bit about, I guess, what brought this massacre to an end, and the so-called moral mission of empire, of this kind of I guess this almost contradiction between wanting to have a moral empire but having to use or insisting on using such violent means in expanding that empire. I imagine this must have been something you came across, Rob, when you were working on Malaya and thinking about Niger, and I'm sure Amma as well, when you or work on West Africa, you must have been grappling with this contradiction that Europe was trying to reconcile between wanting to have this, to be the moral leader of the world, but in engaging in such violence and destruction.
Well, I mean, the violence in Niger was really because of, and I think maybe in an ideal world, maybe we could have done more of this in our film, but the violence of Niger and the violence of Voulet was really because of the intensity of the resistance. When you look at the accounts by some of the French officers, they say, wow, if we didn't have our if we didn't have our machine gun, we would have been in trouble here. So, you know, this is a kind of a perhaps a complexity to the story that we, you know, when you make a film like this, especially a film with so many levels that are going on so many time levels, so many narrative levels, so many political levels, you know, you obviously have to simplify. But the reality is that the Hausa people who became divided by the agreement that Amma was talking about in 1885, and then they made this new agreement between Britain and France to divide the bit between the river Niger, or the river Niger as the British called it, and Lake Chad, and it was a straight line. And then they changed it slightly because the French said, oh, could we have this bit, and can we do that? And then they did it, but this was all being done on pieces of paper. Voulet was going into an area that actually no European people, either from France or Britain, had been to with military forces before. They had been before as like travelers and explorers, but and you know, on diplomatic missions. But he was going into an area where there hadn't really been any kind of sense that the French were actually going to take control, and they did need control of that area. So that was what he was going in for. When Klobb was killed, again, the difficulty in the film maybe is that on the one hand, Klobb is being sent because Voulet is behaving so badly. There is a possibility of a scandal and outrage. But actually, the reality is also that Voulet, because he's doing so much killing and he's gone into this sort of strange place, sort of mental place, shall we say, he's not making very good progress to get to Lake Chad. So the French government are quite worried that they may not do it. Everyone was worried. After he's killed, the French then continue, and they do get to Lake Chad. There's one more big battle. It's quite violent, but it is a bit more of a formal battle. But it is quite violent, but there are casualties on both sides. And then they make their way all the way to Lake Chad, and they secure that area for the French as of 1899. But the really interesting thing is that all of that land that Voulet took, which was actually in the British zone, which we try to, again, quite complicated, but we try to make that clear in the film, all of that land that was in the British zone, 5 years later, in 1904, Britain and France agreed to trade that land. So Britain basically said, okay, you can have that land to France. We'll give you what Voulet gained by all that massacre, that effectively almost a genocide. I mean, it was a genocide, really, in some terms, in that area of Hausa people. We'll give you that land, but we, the British, in return, we'd like to have the fishing rights of the North Atlantic, off the island of Newfoundland, because we want the tuna fishing rights. So that was swapped in 1904. And we couldn't get that into the film either, because this film is bulging with interesting things. But it's actually a very shocking thing that people in Niger feel very, shall we say, sardonically amused and also horrified by the idea that they have grown up in a French country, therefore going to school where French is the language that they learn. And it's all because Britain and France traded some tuna 6,000 miles away, or however far Newfoundland is. But that's imperialism, you know? It's like it's being done on a map in an office in London or Paris, and the lives of hundreds of millions of people are being turned upside down.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, and I guess there's so much historical detail and so many stories that that could have been brought into the film that couldn't fit in. But I think it's fascinating to think about that wider context, and that the story that's told in this film is part of a far longer continuum of power struggles and, importantly, as you mentioned, resistance as well. Could we maybe talk a little bit more about resistance in West Africa, and how while the narratives of African people are often written out, more importantly, I think, or equally as importantly, their resistance is often written out of these kinds of stories as well. And it's so important to include this in the way we think about European colonialism in West Africa.
Yes, definitely. In the colonial invasion of Africa, I think we need to understand, because the dominant narrative presents the colonial conquest and partition as a walkover. that it was easy conquest, but nothing could be further than the truth. And the resistance of many African empires and smaller states, whether it's Saraounia, whom Captain Voulet and the French also met in Niger. Saraounia, the great queen of the Asna people, also fought valiantly against the French. Elsewhere in the West African region, we have Yara Santiwa, we have the great Samore Toure of Guinea, we have Baibure of Sierra Leone, you know, and elsewhere on the African continent, from Shaka Zulu, Queen Nzinga in Angola, Mekatili Wamenza in Kenya. These are stories, historical narratives on the African continent of peoples who fought, who resisted colonialism. And they resisted because they saw it as, you know, an indignity against their way of life, an invasion against their beings, their bodies, and they fought to preserve their societies and their communities. But what was against them, as is pointed out in this film by somebody who said that we did not have guns, they had guns. So it was the military technological superiority in firepower of the Europeans that enabled them to subjugate and dominate Africans. Because as I think Rob said, that the fierceness, the depths of the resilience and the way in which the Africans fought back courageously and valiantly even surprised some of the Europeans. So that just shows you the measure of the extent to which, you know, African peoples up and down the breadth of the African continent fought against the French, the Portuguese, the British. So, you know, that is something that needs to be taught in the telling of African history. That the colonial conquest was no means easy. It was not a facile takeover. That African people resisted the invasion with all means necessary, but were to succumb because of the superior firepower and weapons of the colonial powers.
The film ends, I think, really interestingly with the moments of the summer of 2020, in which we see mass uprisings across many parts of the world against racism. And I think in some ways these uprisings were, although sparked by the killing of George Floyd in the United States, to an extent a kind of imperial reckoning as well for Britain and the British establishment, with the targeting of statues of people like Colston, the slave trader in Bristol, of course, Cecil Rhodes in Oxford, as we see in the film, but also other people who aren't necessarily identified as being related to empire. So, Femi, I was wondering if you could maybe close by talking a little bit about whether you feel like the film will be read differently or received differently, given the fact that we've seen these global uprisings in 2020 since the film was made, and whether that kind of colonial reckoning can have an additional story and additional elements added to it with this particular film.
So you may notice in the film that my haircut changes, and that I put on a few extra pounds between the scene where I'm about to get to Niger and the scene when I'm in Niger, and that's because the film took so long to make. And I'm so happy the film took so long to make, because if it had been released last year, it wouldn't be catching this moment. And the fact that it's led to this moment, and we were just about to, and then the George Floyd thing happened, and colonialism became a conversation and became a central conversation and a topic, means that we can tie that into the political moment, and hopefully more people will learn about the story of Voulet and tie that into the wider story of Churchill and the Bengal famine, tie that into the wider story of Omdurman Sudan, of the Herero massacre, of what has happened across the British Empire, Mau Mau and the rest. And that's something we've always had to try and do with this film. Take one particular dramatization, not dramatization as such, but one particular drama, right? They call it the drama at Dankori, but the drama of Voulet, right? In a wider sense, and tie that in to the wider story of what colonialism and European colonialism really means. I definitely feel as though once the Black Lives Matter protest led to the toppling of the Colston statue in Bristol, that sparked off a domino effect, which meant that the conversation could turn from simply Black Lives Matter to imperial history, the history of slavery, what these histories really mean in the UK. And I definitely think that moment isn't over, and that we need to make sure that moment continues, and that we really start to interrogate, why was Churchill a racist? Why should Rhodes fall? Why a Belgian, seeing what's going on in the UK now, finally after so many years, saying, all right, we're going to take down these statues of Leopold, and think about apologizing for when we reduce the population of the Congo by 10 million, this kind of thing, right? And I definitely I'm very happy that the film has managed to catch this moment, and that it took us so long to make.
I'd like to say that I really hope that in playing a part, maybe playing its small part of trying to contribute to awakening of people's knowledge, awareness and consciousness about this history, which is painful, horrible, and from the point of view of the European powers, sort of shameful. The reality is it's not really history. It's actually the history that's created our present. That's really the thing that really runs through in Niger. Is like, you know, the day when Voulet came to town was the day that our current reality, this I'm speaking as, you know, this is what people in towns and villages in that area, our current reality started. You know, not necessarily being romantic about what it was beforehand, but it basically from that point, these communities, and as Amma has said, across all of Africa and other parts of the world, lose a sense of lose the ability to control their own destiny as a result of these events and this process. But I think at the same time as looking into this and looking quite squarely at it and confronting it and all of its kind of you know, negative grimness, we should also try to find a way of being positive about it. And I think or positive about what that looking into it means. And it's a kind of a symbolic thing, but I think in this film, when we dwell a little bit on solar energy, we are attempting to sort of say that actually there is another, and, you know, of course, as anybody who will see the film will see that there's a huge amount of stuff to do with, you know, a kind of environmental awareness and consciousness that is connected to kind of belief in spirits and stuff that is very prevalent in some of the communities in the area that we were going into in Niger, and the connection between that and respect for the environment, the planet that we live on, the air that we breathe, the plants that grow and the trees that grow and so on and so forth, and what's in the land is all part of that. And again, I'll be really brief actually on this, but and I think I did say this before elsewhere, but you know, solar energy in Niger is something that really needs to be supported, not just in Niger, but lots of other places, but in a very independent way. But actually, a kind of remarkable thing that would come from this film is essentially Niger is the first country where a solar machine was ever built, basically because the French, before they discovered uranium there, wanted to support investment and research into solar power. And actually, it was a Nigerian scientist, Abdou Mamouni, who created the first machine. And I think if there can be a greater awareness of the possibilities for renewable energy and independent renewable energy in Africa, in communities that have been very poor and cut off from you know, development in technological development and in industrial development over the last century, if this film can play only a tiny little part of making awareness of that, then I think that would be, you know, important and very good and pleasing.
Yes, I also found that point about the students studying about solar energy very inspiring. I really did. The other inspiring aspects of the documentary was that every Nigerian school child learns about the French colonial atrocities under Voulet. I thought that was also very important. And I related it or thought about the fact that in this country, the UK, there was a YouGov poll that was published in The Independent in 2016. And it showed that not many British school children nor adults are genuinely familiar with the nature or the details and operations of colonialism. And 44% of people in the poll said that they were proud of colonialism. And we need to ask ourselves, you know, what exactly are they proud of? You know, having watched this film, would they still be proud of colonialism? And 21% in the poll said that they regretted colonialism, and 43% actually said colonialism was a good thing. Again, I ask, if they were to watch this film, would they still say that colonialism had any good in it? And also, I think if a French audience watched it, would they actually still be proud of Voulet's achievements? Because in the film, one young female student, she said that she didn't think very much or very well of the French because they praise Voulet's achievements. So would Europeans, or would people generally, people in the West, really think about, and I think they really need to think about, re-examine, reassess the depths, the profundity of colonialism, its impact, and that it still has a resonance, it still continues to reconfigure itself today in terms of the legacies that we've touched upon in this discussion, that the impoverishment of Africa, the exploitation of Africa continues to this day in new forms, in new ways. And the seeds of that impoverishment, that exploitation, were laid by colonialism, and prior to that, the enslavement of African people in the transatlantic slave trade that continued, that carried on for 400 years before colonialism took over. So therefore, history is very important. It still has a resonance. It is not dead. It still has an effect on people's lives to this day.
I think that's a brilliant place to close. I hope everyone watching really enjoys the film. Anna, thank you so much for your insights. Rob, Femi, congratulations on a brilliant film, which is both creative and insightful and informative, but also, as we've noted, politically urgent, both here in Britain, but I think globally as well. Thank you so much.